Babylon. The most powerful man on earth lay dying. Outside the palace walls stretched the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. An empire built through fire, through blood, through impossible victories. Its ruler was only 32 years old. He had defeated kings, destroyed empires, crossed deserts, mountains, and continents. Entire nations trembled at the sound of his name. And yet, even now, as death crept silently through his body, Alexander was losing the one battle he had been fighting his entire life. Not against Persia, not against rival kings, not against armies, but against something far more terrifying: the fear of being forgotten. For most people, success is enough. For Alexander, success was merely proof that he still wasn't there yet. Every victory created a new horizon. Every horizon created a new hunger. And no matter how far he marched, the feeling remained the same. There was always more to conquer, more to achieve, more to become. History remembers him as Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the world, the undefeated king, the living legend. But beneath the armor, beneath the glory, beneath the myth, there was a frightened boy chasing something he could never fully catch. A boy who grew up believing that ordinary was a fate worse than death. To understand why Alexander spent his life running toward immortality, we must first understand what he was running from. We must travel back more than 3 decades. Back to a rugged kingdom called Macedon. Back to a palace filled with ambition, conflict, and impossible expectations. Back to the shadow that shaped everything. Back to the beginning. Back to the boy named Alexander. Alexander was born in 356 BC in the city of Pella, the capital of Macedon. From the moment he opened his eyes, greatness surrounded him. His father was Philip II, warrior, reformer, conqueror, one of the most brilliant military minds of his age. When Philip inherited the throne, Macedon was weak and vulnerable. By the time Alexander was old enough to walk, Philip had already transformed it into the dominant power in Greece. Victories arrived one after another. Cities surrendered. Enemies vanished. Kings negotiated from fear rather than strength. Everywhere Alexander looked, he saw evidence of his father's greatness. Soldiers praised Philip. Generals praised Philip. Foreign ambassadors praised Philip. The people praised Philip. The entire world seemed to revolve around one man. For most boys, a father like Philip would have been a blessing. For Alexander, he became a mountain. A mountain so large that it blocked the horizon. Ancient historians recorded something strange about the young prince. While other children dreamed about becoming successful, Alexander worried about something entirely different. He feared that his father would accomplish everything before he had the chance. Think about that. Most people spend their lives wondering whether they will ever become great. Alexander spent his childhood wondering whether greatness would still be available when his turn arrived. He was not asking, "Will I succeed?" He was asking, "How can I become greater than the greatest man I know?" That question would become the engine of his entire life. But the pressure did not end with Philip. At home waited another powerful force. His mother, Olympias. If Philip represented achievement, Olympias represented destiny. She was fiercely intelligent, fiercely ambitious, and fiercely protective of her son. Ancient writers describe her as mysterious, passionate, and intensely devoted to the idea that Alexander was meant for something extraordinary. Some stories claim she told him that divine blood flowed through his veins. Others suggest she encouraged him to see himself as chosen by the gods. Whether those stories are entirely true hardly matters. Because what children hear repeatedly eventually becomes part of their identity. Imagine growing up with one parent constantly reminding you how great your father is, and another constantly reminding you that you are destined to become greater. The pressure would be unbearable. Alexander never had the luxury of being ordinary. Before he could discover who he was, the world had already decided who he needed to become. Yet the royal palace was not a place of harmony. Philip and Olympias fought constantly. Arguments echoed through the halls. Political rivalries mixed with family tensions. Trust was fragile. Power was everything. Alexander grew up in an environment where affection and ambition were inseparable, where every relationship carried hidden consequences, where survival depended on strength, where weakness could be exploited, where love often came with conditions. Psychologists often observe that children raised in highly competitive environments learn a dangerous lesson early in life. Their worth becomes tied to achievement. They stop asking, "Who am I?" And begin asking, "What must I accomplish to deserve love?" Alexander's childhood appears haunted by that question, because no matter how impressive he became, there was always someone greater standing nearby. His father, the giant whose shadow stretched across the entire kingdom. Then came the horse. A moment that would become one of the most famous stories in ancient history. One day, a horse trader arrived at court with a magnificent black stallion. The animal was enormous, powerful, beautiful, and completely uncontrollable. The horse bucked wildly, bit handlers, kicked at riders. One by one, experienced horsemen attempted to tame it. One by one, they failed. Eventually, Philip lost patience. The horse was useless, too dangerous, too stubborn. He ordered it removed. Then a young voice interrupted. Alexander stepped forward. He asked for a chance. Laughter spread through the crowd. How could a boy succeed where trained men had failed? But Alexander wasn't watching the horse. He was studying it. While everyone else focused on its aggression, Alexander noticed something different. Fear. The horse kept flinching at its own shadow. No one else had seen it. The animal wasn't rebellious. It was terrified. Alexander slowly turned the horse toward the sun. The shadow disappeared. The horse calmed. Carefully, patiently, he approached. Moments later, he mounted the stallion. Then he rode away. The crowd fell silent. The impossible had happened. The horse obeyed. History remembers the horse as Bucephalus, Alexander's most loyal companion in war. But psychologically, the story matters for another reason. Because for the first time in his life, Alexander accomplished something that even Philip could not. For a brief moment, the shadow disappeared. For a brief moment, people were not looking at Philip. They were looking at Alexander. Ancient accounts claim Philip embraced his son and declared, "My boy, seek a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedon is too small for you." Whether those exact words were spoken is impossible to know. What matters is how Alexander likely felt. Seen, recognized, admired, not as Philip's son, but as himself. That feeling can be intoxicating, especially for someone who spends childhood living beneath another person's legend. Many people experience it once and move on. Alexander spent the rest of his life chasing it. Because the greatest addiction is not power. It is significance. The feeling that you matter. The feeling that your name will survive after you are gone. And somewhere within that moment, standing beside a tamed horse while an entire kingdom watched in astonishment, a dangerous idea began to take root. Perhaps he really was destined for greatness. Perhaps he really could surpass his father. Perhaps he could become more than a king. But destiny has a cost. The higher the dream, the deeper the fear beneath it. And inside Alexander, another force was already growing. A hunger that would soon consume everything. A hunger fed by stories, heroes, legends, and a single idea that would define the rest of his life. The idea that death is inevitable, but being forgotten is optional. The horse had given Alexander confidence, but confidence alone does not create legends. A person may believe they are destined for greatness, yet without a vision of what greatness looks like, that belief remains directionless. Alexander needed more than ambition. He needed a dream, and that dream arrived in the form of a man named Aristotle. When Alexander was 13 years old, Philip made a decision that would quietly alter the course of history. He hired the most famous philosopher in Greece to educate his son, Aristotle. Even in his own lifetime, Aristotle was considered one of the greatest minds in the known world. He studied politics, science, medicine, logic, nature, ethics. To Philip, Aristotle's task was simple: prepare Alexander to become a king. But neither man understood what those lessons would ultimately create. Each morning, Alexander joined a small circle of noble boys at a peaceful sanctuary outside the city, far from court politics, far from military campaigns, far from the noise of power. There, beneath open skies and olive trees, Aristotle taught them how the world worked. He explained why governments rise and fall, why empires collapse, why people obey authority, why fear is often stronger than reason, why some names survive history while others vanish without a trace. Alexander absorbed every lesson with unusual intensity. Unlike many students, he did not study because he was required to. He studied because he was hungry. Hungry for understanding. Hungry for mastery. Hungry for anything that might help him become extraordinary. Every answer led to another question. Every lesson revealed another horizon. The more he learned, the larger the world seemed. And the larger the world became, the more determined he grew to leave his mark upon it. But among all the subjects Aristotle introduced, one captured Alexander's imagination more than any other. A story. An ancient story. The story of Achilles. For centuries, Greek children had grown up listening to the tale of the Trojan War. The greatest hero of that story was Achilles. A warrior, unlike any other. Fast. Fearless. Unstoppable. But what fascinated Alexander was not Achilles' strength. It was his choice. According to legend, Achilles was offered two possible futures. In one future, he would live a long and peaceful life. He would marry, raise children, grow old, and eventually disappear into obscurity. In the other future, he would die young, but his name would live forever. Achilles chose glory. He chose memory. He chose immortality through history. For most boys, this was simply a heroic tale. For Alexander, it felt like a revelation, and perhaps something even darker. A warning. One day, he too would die. Kings die. Warriors die. Empires die. Everyone dies. The only question was whether anyone would remember. The idea struck him with enormous force, because Alexander had spent his entire childhood watching people celebrate greatness, watching them praise his father, watching them remember heroes long after their deaths, watching history transform ordinary men into legends. And now, Aristotle was presenting him with a possibility. Maybe death was not the true enemy. Maybe obscurity was. Maybe the worst fate was not dying. Maybe the worst fate was disappearing. Forgotten. unremembered, insignificant. For most people, greatness is a goal. For Alexander, it became an escape from the terror of being ordinary, an escape from the fear of being forgotten. Something changed inside him. The world was no longer divided into success and failure. It was divided into two groups: those who were remembered and those who vanished. Alexander knew which side he wanted to stand on. As the years passed, he began measuring himself against heroes instead of men. Against Achilles, against Hercules, against the giants of myth. Every achievement had to be larger. Every victory had to be greater. Every dream had to reach beyond the limits of ordinary human ambition. Philip conquered Greece. Then Alexander would conquer Asia. Someone built a kingdom. Then Alexander would build an empire. Someone became famous. Then Alexander would become immortal. The hunger was growing. And hunger has a dangerous quality. It never stays satisfied for long. The moment one goal is reached, another appears. The moment one mountain is climbed, a higher peak emerges from the clouds. Alexander was beginning to build a psychological trap for himself. A future in which no achievement would ever feel complete. Because how do you know when you've done enough to be remembered forever? How much glory is enough? How much success is enough? How much conquest is enough? There are no clear answers. And so the chase never ends. Yet there was another influence shaping Alexander's heart. One that history often overlooks. A young nobleman named Hephaestion. The two boys grew up together. Studied together, learned under Aristotle together, shared the same dreams together. Over time, they became inseparable. In a world filled with politics, expectations, and constant competition, Hephaestion offered something rare: safety. Around generals, Alexander had to be impressive. Around nobles, he had to be strategic. Around his parents, he had to be exceptional. Around Hephaestion, he could simply be human. The friendship became the emotional center of his life. The one relationship untouched by rivalry. The one relationship untouched by ambition. The one place where he did not need to prove himself. History would later compare them to Achilles and Patroclus, the legendary companions of the Iliad. The comparison deeply affected Alexander. Not only because he admired Achilles, but because he increasingly saw his own life reflected in the story. A great hero, a loyal companion, a destiny waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Years later, as he marched across deserts and battlefields, Alexander carried many treasures: gold, jewels, weapons, maps. Yet one possession mattered more than all the others: a copy of Homer's Iliad. According to ancient accounts, he kept it close wherever he traveled, sometimes even beneath his pillow while he slept. Think about what that means. The future conqueror of the world slept beside a story. Not because it entertained him, but because it reminded him who he wanted to become. Every page brought him closer to Achilles. Every chapter reinforced the same belief: a short life filled with glory was better than a long life forgotten by history. Day after day, year after year, the lessons settled deeper into his mind. He was no longer preparing to become a king. He was preparing to become a legend. And legends do not think like ordinary people. Ordinary people seek comfort. Legends seek significance. Ordinary people fear death. Legends fear obscurity. Ordinary people ask, how can I live well? Alexander was beginning to ask, how can I be remembered forever? It is a beautiful question. It is also a dangerous one. Because once a person becomes obsessed with immortality through achievement, the finish line disappears. No amount of success can guarantee eternity. No amount of praise can silence insecurity. No amount of conquest can completely erase the fear beneath it. And deep inside Alexander, beneath all the ambition and confidence, a quieter fear continued to grow. A fear he had carried since childhood. A fear born in the shadow of Philip. What if I spend my entire life chasing greatness and still remain in another man's shadow? That fear would soon be tested, because the relationship between father and son was approaching a breaking point. And when it finally shattered, it would transform Alexander forever. The boy who once sought his father's approval would soon begin chasing something else entirely. Not admiration, not acceptance, not love, but supremacy. What if I spend my entire life chasing greatness and still remain in another man's shadow? For years, Alexander had been building an image of the man he wanted to become. A warrior greater than Achilles. A ruler greater than Philip. A name that history itself would be unable to erase. But ambition is rarely born from confidence alone. Beneath every great dream often hides an equally great fear. And the higher Alexander's ambitions climbed, the darker that fear became. Because despite all his talent, despite Aristotle's teachings, despite the admiration he earned wherever he went, one problem remained unsolved. Philip was still alive. The giant still stood. Every victory Alexander achieved was measured against his father. Every success was compared to Philip's success. Every accomplishment seemed smaller beside the legend that had already conquered Greece. And with each passing year, Philip continued winning, continued expanding, continued growing larger. The shadow refused to disappear. Imagine spending your entire life preparing for greatness, only to watch someone else become greater and greater before your eyes. Imagine dreaming of immortality, while another man's name fills every conversation. The fear began quietly, a whisper in the back of Alexander's mind. What if there is no place left for me? What if my father becomes everything I dream of becoming? What if history remembers Philip and forgets me? The thought terrified him, not because he doubted his abilities, but because he understood something most people never realize. History has room for very few legends, and legends cast long shadows. Then came the event that transformed fear into resentment. The moment when admiration turned into rivalry. The moment when a son stopped seeking approval and started preparing for war. Not against Persia, not against Greece, but against the ghost of his own father. The stage was set. The wine was poured. The torches were lit. And in a royal banquet hall filled with nobles, soldiers, and political enemies, the fragile bond between Philip and Alexander would finally shatter. Forever. What if history remembers Philip and forgets me? In 336 BC, Philip II was dead. The giant whose shadow had defined Alexander's entire life was gone. One moment, he had been the most powerful man in Greece. The next, he was bleeding on the ground before a crowd of horrified spectators. The assassin vanished into chaos. The celebration dissolved into panic. And history changed direction in a single afternoon. For Alexander, the moment was both a tragedy and an opportunity. The father he had spent years trying to impress was gone forever. But so was the shadow. The question that had haunted him since childhood now stood before him. Who was Alexander without Philip? For the first time in his life, he would have to find out. At only 20 years old, he inherited a kingdom. And a crisis. Across Greece, enemies sensed weakness. Rival cities whispered about rebellion. Foreign powers watched carefully. Many believed the young king would collapse within months. After all, Alexander had inherited Philip's throne. But he had not yet inherited Philip's reputation. Kings are not judged by what they inherit. They are judged by what they survive. And Alexander understood something many rulers never learn. Power is lost in perception before it is lost in reality. The moment people believe you are weak, they begin acting against you. So, Alexander moved first. And he moved fast. Potential rivals disappeared. Political threats were neutralized. The army pledged loyalty. Nobles who hesitated quickly changed their minds. The uncertainty surrounding his succession vanished almost overnight. The young king was sending a message. Philip may be dead. Macedon is not. Yet fear still lingered throughout Greece. Many city-states viewed Alexander as temporary. A boy wearing a dead king's crown. Someone who could be challenged. Someone who could be tested. Then came Thebes. The city heard a rumor. Alexander had died during a northern campaign. To the Thebans, it sounded like freedom. The moment they had been waiting for. Rebellion erupted. Macedonian authority was rejected. The city prepared for war. But the rumor was wrong. Alexander was very much alive. And moving toward them. Fast. Terrifyingly fast. One day, Thebes believed he was dead. A few days later, his army appeared outside their walls. The city was stunned. The young king they thought weak had crossed hundreds of miles with astonishing speed. Suddenly, the rebellion no longer looked brave. It looked suicidal. Alexander offered terms. Thebes refused. The battle that followed was brutal. When it ended, the city lay in ruins. Its walls were destroyed. Thousands were killed or enslaved. Ancient Greece watched in horror. The message could not have been clearer. The boy king was gone. A conqueror had arrived. Fear replaced doubt. Resistance evaporated. The rebellion that might have destroyed his reign instead became the foundation of it. Alexander had achieved something remarkable. At 20 years old, he controlled Greece more completely than Philip ever had. Most rulers would have stopped there. Most rulers would have consolidated power, protected their kingdom, enjoyed their victory. But Alexander had spent too many years dreaming about immortality. Greece was not the destination. It was the beginning. Across the Aegean Sea lay the Persian Empire, the largest empire on earth. A civilization stretching across continents. Millions of subjects. Immense wealth. Ancient prestige. For generations, Persian kings had dominated the known world. To ordinary men, Persia looked unconquerable. To Alexander, it looked like an opportunity. Because greatness requires comparison. And Alexander was no longer measuring himself against Philip. He was measuring himself against history. In the spring of 334 BC, he stood on the shores of the Hellespont. Europe behind him. Asia ahead. Legend tells us that Alexander threw a spear into the soil and claimed the continent by right of conquest. Whether the story is true hardly matters. Because psychologically, it reveals exactly how he saw himself. He was not crossing as a king seeking territory. He was crossing as a man seeking immortality. The journey that followed would change the world. But first, it would reveal something about Alexander himself. The first great test came at the Granicus River. The Persian army waited on the opposite bank. The position heavily favored the defenders. Experienced generals urged caution. Wait for a better opportunity. Find a safer crossing. Avoid unnecessary risk. The advice was reasonable. Alexander ignored it. Instead, he led the charge, himself, straight into the river, straight into enemy weapons, straight into danger. It was reckless. It was terrifying. It was exactly what Alexander needed. Because Granicus was not merely a battle. It was a declaration. At Granicus, Alexander proved he was fearless. As cavalry collided in the rushing water, chaos erupted. Men drowned. Horses screamed. Steel crashed against steel. At one point, a Persian nobleman raised a battle axe and swung directly at Alexander's head. The blow shattered part of his helmet. For a brief instant, history balanced on the edge of a blade. Then a companion intervened. The Persian was cut down. Alexander survived. The battle was won. The Persian line collapsed. The invasion continued. But something more important happened that day. The soldiers saw their king charging where others would hesitate. They saw him risking his life beside them, not behind them. The legend had begun. Yet courage alone does not build empires. Many brave men die forgotten. Alexander needed something else. And the next great battle would reveal it. By 331 BC, the war had transformed into a personal duel between Alexander and Darius III, King of Kings, Master of Persia, ruler of the greatest empire on earth. The confrontation came at Gaugamela. The Persian army stretched across the landscape. Ancient sources almost certainly exaggerate the numbers. But one fact remains clear. Alexander was heavily outnumbered. His generals looked at the battlefield and saw disaster. Alexander looked at the battlefield and saw possibility. Because where Granicus had showcased courage, Gaugamela would showcase genius. Rather than attacking directly, Alexander moved his cavalry outward. The Persians followed. Their massive formation began stretching, shifting, expanding. Then it happened. A tiny opening appeared near the center. For most commanders, it would have been invisible. For Alexander, it was everything. The moment he saw the gap, he attacked. His cavalry formed a wedge, and Alexander drove himself directly toward Darius. Not the army. The king. The move was as psychological as it was tactical. Panic spread. Command structures collapsed. Darius fled. The Persian line broke. And in a matter of hours, the greatest empire in the world began to fall apart. At Gaugamela, Alexander proved he was brilliant. The fearless prince had become a military genius. The conqueror was becoming something larger than life. But the next challenge would reveal the most dangerous part of his personality. Not courage, not intelligence. Obsession. The city of Tyre stood on an island half a mile offshore, protected by enormous walls rising directly from the sea. It was considered impregnable. Tyre mocked Alexander, ignored his demands, trusted the ocean to protect them. Most commanders would have moved on. The city posed an inconvenience, not a true threat. A rational leader would have continued east. Alexander could not, because Tyre represented something he hated. A limit, an obstacle, a barrier between himself and total victory. And Alexander had begun developing a psychological inability to tolerate barriers. If there was no road to Tyre, he would build one. He ordered his men to construct a massive stone causeway stretching across the sea. The task seemed impossible. Storms destroyed sections of it. Enemy ships attacked it. Workers died building it. Months passed. The project consumed extraordinary resources. Generals questioned his sanity. The city was not worth this much effort. Alexander disagreed. Because Tyre was no longer a city, it was a challenge. and challenges had become personal. For 7 months, the construction continued. Stone by stone, meter by meter. The sea itself seemed to resist him. Alexander kept building. Finally, the causeway reached the walls. Tyre fell, and the ancient world learned something terrifying. Alexander's greatest weapon was not his army. It was his refusal to accept reality when reality contradicted his ambition. At Granicus, he proved he was fearless. At Gaugamela, he proved he was brilliant. But Tyre revealed something darker. Alexander was no longer proving what he could do. He was proving what he could not tolerate. Limits. The victories continued. Cities surrendered. Kingdoms collapsed. The horizon kept moving, and Alexander kept chasing it. Each conquest brought him closer to the dream he had carried since childhood. The dream born beneath the shadow of Philip. The dream strengthened by Achilles. The dream of becoming unforgettable. Soon, he would stand at the summit of the known world. Soon, he would possess everything he had ever wanted. And that is where the real tragedy begins. Because some desires become more dangerous after they are fulfilled. Some desires become more dangerous after they are fulfilled. For most stories, this is where the ending would begin. The hero triumphs. The enemy falls. The kingdom is saved. The world celebrates. And the credits roll. But Alexander's story was never about conquest. It was about hunger. And hunger behaves differently than victory. Victory satisfies. Hunger expands. The more it consumes, the larger it becomes. By the age of 30, Alexander had achieved what no Greek could have imagined. The Persian Empire was shattered. Darius III was defeated. The wealth of Asia belonged to him. The cities that once feared Persian kings now bowed before a young Macedonian ruler. The boy who had spent his childhood staring up at Philip's shadow now stood alone at the summit of the world. No rival remained. No equal existed. No father overshadowed him. No empire stood above him. The dream was complete. Or at least, it should have been. Because this is the point where most people expect happiness to arrive. The promotion. The fortune. The success. The recognition. The thing we tell ourselves will finally make everything feel worthwhile. Alexander had reached that moment. And for a brief time, the world appeared to agree. Egypt surrendered without resistance. Its people welcomed him as a liberator rather than an invader. Priests crowned him pharaoh. Ancient traditions that had endured for thousands of years now embraced a foreign king. To the Egyptians, Alexander seemed favored by destiny. To Alexander, destiny was becoming increasingly real. Then came the journey to Siwa. Deep within the western desert stood a remote temple dedicated to the god Amun. The trip itself was dangerous. Endless sand, brutal heat, isolation. Yet Alexander insisted on making the pilgrimage. The reason was simple. Conquering the world was no longer enough. He wanted confirmation. Confirmation that he was different, chosen, extraordinary, perhaps even divine. According to ancient accounts, the priests welcomed him not merely as a king but as the son of a god. The exact details remain uncertain. History has blurred the facts with legend. But what matters is not what the priests said. What matters is what Alexander heard. For years, Olympius had whispered stories of divine ancestry. For years, he had compared himself to Achilles and Hercules. For years, he had chased immortality. Now the world itself seemed to be validating those beliefs. The line between man and myth began to disappear. And that line would never fully return. Because power changes people. not simply because it gives them authority, but because it changes the feedback they receive from reality. The more powerful someone becomes, the fewer people are willing to tell them they are wrong. The fewer people challenge them. The fewer people remind them they are human. Success creates gravity. And eventually, everyone begins orbiting around the person at the center. But Alexander was entering that dangerous territory. The territory where admiration slowly transforms into worship. Where confidence transforms into certainty. Where certainty transforms into entitlement. And where entitlement transforms into isolation. Yet outwardly, everything appeared perfect. When Alexander entered Babylon, he entered not as a conqueror. He entered as the master of Asia. The city was magnificent. Ancient walls towered above the landscape. Wealth flowed through its streets. Generations of kings had dreamed of ruling such a place. Alexander had achieved it before his 30th birthday. The impossible had happened. The boy who feared being forgotten had become the most famous man alive. The boy who feared remaining in Philip's shadow had built something so vast that Philip's accomplishments suddenly seemed small by comparison. The boy who idolized Achilles had become a legend in his own lifetime. Everything he had ever wanted stood before him. And for a brief moment, Alexander experienced the most dangerous feeling of his life. Emptiness. Not despair. Not sadness. Something stranger. A void. Because if glory was the answer, why did he still feel hungry? If immortality was the goal, why did it feel so fragile? If he had finally escaped insignificance, why was he already looking toward the next horizon? Psychologists call this the arrival fallacy. The illusion that happiness lives somewhere in the future. The belief that once we achieve a certain goal, fulfillment will finally arrive. But when we reach that destination, something unsettling happens. We remain ourselves. The insecurities come with us. The fears come with us. The emptiness comes with us. Alexander had spent his entire life believing that conquest would silence the fear within him. Instead, the fear survived. The victories grew larger. The fear remained. And because the fear remained, the hunger remained. Perhaps that is why he refused to stop. Most rulers would have returned home. Most rulers would have spent the rest of their lives governing their empire. Alexander kept moving. East. Always east. Toward mountains no Greek had crossed. Toward deserts no Greek had mapped. Toward lands that existed only as rumors. His generals struggled to understand. His soldiers were exhausted. They had already achieved more than anyone thought possible. What else was there to prove? But that question misunderstood Alexander completely. He was no longer trying to prove something to the world. He was trying to prove something to himself. And internal battles are the most dangerous ones. Because there is no clear victory. No finish line. No final conquest. Only temporary relief. Then the hunger returns. As the campaigns pushed deeper into Central Asia, the nature of the war began to change. The grand victories of Persia were gone. There were no great kings left to defeat. No legendary capitals waiting to be captured. Only endless resistance. Mountain tribes. Guerrilla fighters. Remote fortresses. The rewards became smaller. The costs became larger. Yet Alexander continued. Because by now, conquest had become more than strategy. It had become identity. Who was Alexander if he stopped moving? Who was Alexander if there were no more victories? Who was Alexander without another horizon to chase? These questions terrified him. And so he marched. Again. And again. And again. Each mile carrying him farther from the world he had conquered. and closer to the man he was becoming. A man increasingly isolated by his own greatness. A man slowly beginning to believe his own legend. A man drifting toward a dangerous conclusion. That perhaps he truly was different from everyone else. That perhaps ordinary rules no longer applied to him. That perhaps the distance between a king and a god was not as great as people imagined. The transformation was subtle, almost invisible. But history was approaching a turning point. Because the same ambition that built Alexander's empire was beginning to consume Alexander himself. The hunger that once made him extraordinary was evolving into something darker. Something more destructive. Something that no enemy army could defeat. And soon, for the first time in his life, Alexander would discover that the greatest threat to his empire was not Persia. Not rebellion. Not war. But Alexander himself. Success changes people. Not always because it makes them arrogant. Sometimes because it removes the limits that once kept them grounded. For most of his life, Alexander had been restrained by obstacles. His father, his enemies, his circumstances, his own uncertainty. Each challenge forced him to prove himself. Each victory required effort. Each achievement demanded sacrifice. But now, those obstacles were disappearing. There were no rival kings left to challenge him. No empire large enough to threaten him. No battlefield capable of humbling him. The world had stopped saying no, and that was precisely the problem. Because human beings need resistance. We need friction. We need reality pushing back against our ambitions. Without it, our self-image begins to drift. The boundary between who we are and who we believe ourselves to be becomes increasingly blurred. Alexander was entering that dangerous territory. For years, people had called him extraordinary. Now they were calling him divine. And slowly, he began to listen. At first, the changes seemed harmless. He adopted Persian clothing, Persian customs, Persian court rituals. To Alexander, these were practical decisions. He was no longer ruling Macedonians alone. He was ruling a vast multicultural empire. He needed Persians to see him as their king as well. But many of his Macedonian companions saw something else. They saw a man becoming increasingly disconnected from the people who had followed him from the beginning. The distance widened. Slowly. Then steadily. Then dramatically. The soldiers who once viewed Alexander as one of their own now struggled to recognize him. The king who had charged beside them at Granicus was becoming harder to find. In his place stood a ruler surrounded by ceremony, surrounded by admiration, surrounded by people too frightened to disagree with him. And the more isolated Alexander became, the more he retreated into the only identity that still seemed large enough to contain him. The legend. For years, he had compared himself to Achilles. Now he began comparing himself to gods. The transformation was not immediate. It never is. People rarely wake up one morning believing they are above everyone else. It happens gradually. One exception at a time. One justification at a time. One success at a time. Until eventually the extraordinary becomes normal. And normal no longer feels enough. Alexander had spent his life chasing greatness. Now, greatness itself was becoming ordinary. His victories no longer amazed him. His power no longer satisfied him. His reputation no longer filled the emptiness. The hunger remained. And because the hunger remained, it demanded something bigger. Something impossible. Not victory. Not power. Not glory. Validation. Proof that he truly was what he had spent his entire life trying to become. A figure beyond ordinary humanity. a man worthy of immortality. Yet the deeper Alexander disappeared into his myth, the more dangerous reality became. Because reality has a habit of returning when we least expect it. The collision came during a banquet in the city of Mariconda, a night that would become one of the most revealing moments of Alexander's life. Wine flowed freely. Stories filled the hall. Flattery echoed from every direction. Guests praised Alexander's victories, praised his brilliance, praised his destiny, praised his greatness. Then, someone spoke differently. His name was Clitus the Black. He was not merely a general. He was an old friend, a veteran companion, and the man who had once saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River. Years earlier, when a Persian warrior had nearly split Alexander's skull open with an axe, Clitus had intervened at the last possible moment. Without Clitus, there would have been no empire, no legend, no Alexander the Great, which made what happened next all the more tragic. As the evening continued, Clitus grew increasingly frustrated. He listened as courtiers praised Alexander's achievements, listened as Macedonian traditions were mocked, listened as the king's growing obsession with divinity filled the room. Finally, he snapped. He stood and spoke openly, dangerously, openly. He reminded Alexander that many of his victories had been won by Macedonian blood. He reminded Alexander that Philip had laid the foundation for everything that followed. He mocked the growing claims of divinity. And then, perhaps without realizing it, Clitus touched the deepest wound in Alexander's soul. The wound that had never healed. The wound that had existed long before Persia, long before Babylon, long before empire. The wound called Philip, because hidden beneath all the glory remained a terrified child asking the same question he had asked decades earlier. Am I truly great, or am I simply standing on another man's shoulders? Clitus had accidentally spoken the sentence Alexander feared most, that perhaps his greatness was not entirely his own, that perhaps Philip still lived inside every victory, that perhaps the shadow had never disappeared at all. For a moment, the room froze. Then Alexander exploded. Years of insecurity, years of pressure, years of hunger, years of unresolved fear, all erupted at once. He grabbed a spear. People rushed forward. Voices shouted. Friends tried to restrain him. It was too late. The spear left his hand and buried itself in Clitus's chest. Silence. Absolute silence. The general collapsed. The room froze. And suddenly, the rage vanished. Reality returned. Alexander stared at the body. The blood. The stillness. The horror. The man lying dead before him was not an enemy, not a rival, not a Persian king. It was a friend, a brother, a man who had once saved his life. Alexander rushed forward. He wept, screamed, tried to pull the spear free. But nothing could undo what had happened. For 3 days, he locked himself away, refusing food, refusing water, refusing comfort. The conqueror of nations had finally encountered an enemy he could not defeat. Himself. The tragedy of Clitus was not merely murder. It was revelation. For the first time, Alexander saw what his obsession had become. The fear of being forgotten had pushed him to greatness. But now it was consuming the very people he loved. His ambition had crossed a line. No longer serving him. Now controlling him. Yet even this was not enough to stop the machine he had built. Because obsession has its own momentum. Once it begins rolling downhill, it rarely stops after a single warning. Alexander mourned. He regretted. He suffered. Then he marched again. Further east. Further into uncertainty. Further into himself. Because the same voice that had driven him since childhood still whispered in the darkness. One more victory. One more horizon. One more conquest. And then you will finally find peace. It was a lie. But it was a lie Alexander desperately wanted to believe. The years that followed pushed both king and army beyond their limits. Mountains gave way to jungles. Deserts gave way to monsoons. The familiar world disappeared behind them. Ahead lay India, a land larger, stranger, and more intimidating than anything they had yet encountered. Alexander saw another horizon, another opportunity, another step toward immortality. His men saw something different, the end of their strength. And for the first time since the campaign began, the desires of the king and the desires of his army were no longer the same. One side wanted to keep chasing the dream. The other wanted to go home. The collision was inevitable. Because every obsession eventually reaches a point where reality refuses to move any further. And for Alexander, that moment was waiting beyond the next river. Every obsession eventually reaches a point where reality refuses to move any further. For nearly a decade, Alexander had marched east. Across mountains, across deserts, across empires, across the limits of what anyone believed possible. Every challenge had ended the same way. Alexander advanced. The world retreated. When cities resisted, they fell. When kings opposed him, they fled. When geography stood in his way, he crossed it. When reality said no, he forced reality to change its answer. That pattern had defined his entire life. But every pattern eventually breaks. And for Alexander, the breaking point arrived in India. The land itself seemed designed to oppose him. The climate was unfamiliar. The terrain unforgiving. The distances endless. Monsoon rains poured from the sky for weeks at a time. Roads dissolved into mud. Armor rusted. Food spoiled. Disease spread. The soldiers who had followed him from Macedon were no longer young men chasing glory. They were veterans. Scarred. Exhausted. Homesick. Many had spent nearly a third of their lives at war. And still Alexander pushed forward. Because Alexander did not see India. He saw another horizon, another opportunity, another chance to outrun the fear that had haunted him since childhood. The fear that somewhere, somehow, he still had not done enough. Then came the Battle of the Hydaspes River. On the opposite bank waited King Porus, a formidable ruler, a courageous commander, and a weapon the Macedonians had never truly faced before. War elephants, massive beasts covered in armor, towering over men and horses alike. To many of Alexander's soldiers, they looked like monsters from mythology. The battle was brutal. Rain battered the field. Men drowned in the river. Horses panicked. Elephants crushed soldiers beneath their feet. The fighting lasted for hours. But once again, Alexander found a way. His tactical brilliance prevailed. Porus was defeated. The battlefield belonged to Macedon. Officially, it was another victory. But something had changed. For the first time in years, victory felt hollow. The men celebrated less. The cheers were quieter. The enthusiasm weaker. Because everyone understood the truth. The army had won. But the army was breaking. Alexander, however, remained unchanged. Or perhaps more accurately, he remained trapped. The same hunger that had carried him across the world still burned inside him. If Persia had not satisfied it, perhaps India would. If India did not satisfy it, perhaps something beyond India would. The logic was endless, because obsession always promises that fulfillment lies just beyond the next achievement. And obsession always lies. Soon Alexander announced his next objective: the Ganges. Beyond it lay kingdoms richer than any he had encountered, lands larger than Persia, new worlds waiting to be conquered. To Alexander, the journey was obvious. To his soldiers, it was madness. They had marched over 17,000 miles. They had crossed deserts that killed thousands. They had buried friends, brothers, fathers, and sons. They had given Alexander everything. Now they had nothing left. The confrontation arrived at the Hyphasis River, one of the most important moments in Alexander's life, and one of the least discussed, because for the first time, Alexander faced an enemy he could not outmaneuver. Not Persia, not rebellion, not geography, human limits. The army refused to continue. At first, Alexander could not believe it. This had never happened before. His men had followed him into impossible situations, across impossible distances, against impossible odds. And now they were saying no. Alexander gathered his officers. He gave speeches, magnificent speeches. He spoke of glory, of destiny, of immortality, of reaching the edge of the world. He reminded them of everything they had accomplished together. He appealed to their courage, their pride, their loyalty. Years earlier, those words would have ignited fire. Years earlier, they would have followed him anywhere. Now the response was silence. Not defiance. Not rebellion. Something worse. Exhaustion. The men simply had nothing left to give. For the first time in his life, Alexander discovered a terrifying truth. You can inspire people beyond their limits, but not forever. Even legends eventually collide with reality. For 3 days, Alexander remained inside his tent, refusing to accept the answer, waiting for his army to change its mind. They never did. Finally, he emerged and spoke the words that shattered the dream he had carried since childhood. Turn back. The conqueror of the world had been defeated, not by an enemy, by a boundary. A human boundary. The same boundary he had spent his entire life pretending did not exist. The retreat began, and with it came a slow, psychological unraveling. The march back through the Gedrosian desert became one of the most disastrous episodes of Alexander's career. Heat scorched the earth. Water vanished. Thousands died from thirst, starvation, and exhaustion. Entire units disappeared beneath the desert sun. The army survived, but barely. The physical suffering was immense. Yet an even greater loss awaited Alexander. One that no military genius could overcome. One that no empire could replace. One that no amount of conquest could heal. His name was Hephaestion. For decades, Hephaestion had been more than a friend. More than a general, more than a companion. He was the one person who existed before the empire, before the myth, before the god, the one person who still knew Alexander the human being. Not Alexander the Great, not Alexander the Conqueror, just Alexander. Then, in 324 BC, Hephaestion fell ill. At first, nobody panicked. People recovered from fevers all the time. But this fever worsened, day after day, until finally, Hephaestion died. The news shattered Alexander completely. Witnesses described scenes that bordered on madness. Alexander threw himself upon the body, weeping uncontrollably, refusing to leave. refusing to accept reality. The man who had faced armies without fear suddenly found himself helpless. Because grief does not negotiate. Grief does not surrender. Grief cannot be conquered. For decades, Alexander had feared being forgotten. Now, for the first time, he encountered something worse. Remembering. Every memory became a wound. Every shared victory became pain. Every mile they had traveled together became unbearable. The loss exposed something Alexander had spent years trying to hide. Beneath the armor. Beneath the titles. Beneath the mythology. He was profoundly alone. And now the one person who truly understood him was gone. His reaction was extreme. He executed the physician who failed to save Hephaestion. He ordered massive mourning rituals throughout the empire. He cut his hair in imitation of Achilles mourning Patroclus. He demanded divine honors for his fallen companion. The grief consumed him. Because Hephaestion's death destroyed the final illusion. Alexander had spent his life pursuing immortality. Yet the person he loved most had died anyway. All the victories, all the wealth, all the glory, none of it could protect a single human life. Not even the one that mattered most. For years, Alexander had been running from mortality. Now mortality stood directly in front of him. Unavoidable, unconquerable, patient, waiting. The irony was devastating. The man who conquered the world could not save his closest friend. The man who defeated empires could not defeat death. And deep down, perhaps for the first time, Alexander understood something he had spent his entire life refusing to accept. He was not a god. He never had been. He was a man. A brilliant man. A legendary man. But still a man. And men die. Soon after returning to Babylon, Alexander began planning new campaigns. Arabia. North Africa. Perhaps even farther. The pattern continued. Another horizon. Another objective. Another attempt to outrun the emptiness. But something was different now. The fire remained. The purpose did not. The dream that once drove him forward had become exhausted. The empire was vast. The victories countless. The legend complete. Yet inside, Alexander was running on momentum alone. And momentum can only carry a man so far. Because while Alexander continued making plans for the future was already running out. Death was approaching. Quietly. Patiently. And unlike every opponent that came before it, death was not impressed by greatness. Death was not impressed by greatness. Babylon, the city that had welcomed Alexander as the master of Asia, would become the place where his story ended. Not on a battlefield. Not beneath the walls of a great city. Not facing an army. But in a room. A quiet room. The kind of room where all legends eventually arrive. For years, Alexander had lived as though death were something that happened to other people. Kings fell. Generals died. Empires collapsed. Yet he always seemed to move forward. Untouched. Protected. Chosen. As if destiny itself had wrapped its arms around him. Now destiny had finally let go. The fever arrived suddenly. At first, no one seemed overly concerned. Alexander had survived wounds. Exhaustion. Disease. Campaigns that should have killed him many times over. Surely he would survive this as well. But the fever worsened. Day by day. The strongest man in the world grew weaker. His body began betraying him. His strength faded. His voice weakened. The energy that had carried him across continents slowly disappeared. Soon he could no longer stand. Then he could barely speak. Outside the palace, anxiety spread throughout the army. These were hardened veterans. Men who had crossed deserts. Men who had faced elephants. Men who had watched entire kingdoms fall. Yet now, they stood helpless. Because there was nothing to fight. No enemy to charge. No battle to win. No strategy to execute. Only time. And time was winning. As Alexander's condition deteriorated, rumors spread through Babylon. Some whispered that he had been poisoned. Others blamed disease. History still debates the cause. But ultimately, the cause matters less than the outcome. Because regardless of how he died, the same truth remained. Alexander was losing the one battle he could never avoid. The battle against mortality. One by one, his soldiers were allowed to pass by his bedside. Ancient accounts describe thousands filing silently through the room. Veterans, companions, officers, men who had followed him to the ends of the earth. Many wept openly. Others stood in stunned silence. Before them lay the man who had seemed larger than life itself. The man who had carried them through impossible victories. The man who had convinced them that limits existed only to be broken. Now he could barely raise his hand. And perhaps for the first time, they saw him clearly. Not as a conqueror. Not as a legend. Not as a god. But as a human being. Fragile. Mortal. Temporary. Like everyone else. Eventually, someone asked the question that hung over the entire empire. Who should inherit the throne? Who should rule the greatest empire the world had ever seen? According to legend, Alexander whispered a short answer. To the strongest. Whether those exact words were spoken is impossible to know. What matters is what happened next. Because the moment Alexander died, the empire began dying with him. The unity he created shattered. Generals turned against one another. Wars erupted. Alliances collapsed. Blood filled the vacuum left behind. Within years, the empire that had taken a lifetime of obsession to build was fragmented. The dream dissolved. The cities remained. The territories remained. But Alexander's empire, as a single living entity, was gone. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. The man who conquered the world could not preserve his own creation. The empire vanished. The conqueror remained. 2,000 years have passed since Alexander died. His empire is gone. His palaces are gone. His bloodline disappeared. Even the exact location of his tomb remains unknown. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen since his final breath. Yet somehow, his name survived. Alexander the Great. The immortality he spent his life chasing was granted in full. Children still learn his story. Historians still debate his decisions. Filmmakers still recreate his victories. Writers still study his mind. The world remembers him. Exactly as he hoped. And yet there is a strange sadness hidden inside that achievement. Because Alexander achieved everything. Everything. He became famous beyond imagination. He became powerful beyond measure. He became one of the most recognized names in human history. And it still wasn't enough. The hunger never left. The fear never disappeared. The emptiness remained. Because the thing Alexander was fighting was never Persia. It was never Darius. It was never India. It was never another empire. It was himself. More specifically, it was a belief. A belief that many of us quietly carry today. The belief that our worth exists somewhere in the future. The belief that peace waits on the other side of achievement. The belief that one more victory will finally make us feel complete. One more promotion. One more milestone. One more accomplishment. One more proof that we matter. Alexander followed that belief farther than any human being in history. And he discovered something most of us never get the chance to learn. There is always another horizon. Always another mountain. Always another conquest. Achievement can solve many problems, but it cannot answer questions that were never external to begin with. No empire can cure insecurity. No amount of admiration can create self-worth. No level of success can permanently silence fear. The fear simply changes shape. And if left unexamined, it continues driving us long after we believe we are in control. That is why Alexander's story still feels modern. Because most of us are not trying to conquer continents, but many of us are trying to outrun something. A fear, a wound, a feeling of not being enough, a desperate need to prove ourselves, to our parents, to society, to strangers, to ourselves. And sometimes that pursuit creates extraordinary results. Sometimes it creates careers, fortunes, achievements, legacies. But there is a question Alexander forces us to confront. What happens if we reach the summit and discover we brought the emptiness with us? Because the tragedy of Alexander the Great is not that he died at 32. Everyone dies. The tragedy is that he spent his entire life searching for something he already possessed. Significance. Not because he conquered the world, but because he existed. Because he loved. Because he struggled. Because he dreamed. Because he was human. The irony is almost unbearable. The man who spent his life chasing immortality became immortal. But only after death. The man who spent his life trying to escape being forgotten became unforgettable, but never lived long enough to enjoy it. The man who conquered nearly everything never discovered the one victory that mattered most. Contentment. Perhaps that is why his story continues to echo across centuries. Not as a blueprint for greatness, but as a warning about the cost of unlimited ambition. Alexander reached the edge of the world and found that the horizon never ends. The dust claimed his empire. History preserved his name. The question is not whether the world will remember us. The question is whether we can find peace before it forgets. Because, in the end, the greatest battle was never for Asia. It was never for Persia. It was never for glory. It was the quiet war between achievement and contentment. Between becoming more and believing you are already enough. Alexander conquered the world, but he never conquered that. And perhaps that is why we still remember him. Not because he was the greatest conqueror who ever lived, but because, beneath all the legends, he was something far more familiar. A human being searching for meaning. Just like us. Fade to black.